Welcome again. Thank you for joining the fifth session of the Foundations of Economic Thought, hosted by the Penn Initiative for the Study of Markets at the University of Pennsylvania. The session, as always, will last for 90 minutes. The lecture will run for approximately 60 to 75 minutes, followed by a session of questions. Feel free to submit them at any time using some Q&A function. Today, we're pleased to welcome Dr. Andrej Svorenčík, Research Fellow at the Penn Initiative for the Study of Markets and Research Affiliate at the Balras Pareto Center for History, Economic, and Political Thought. He also was recently elected as Executive Officer of the History of Economic Society. And Andrej's lecture will continue with the theme on Marx. He will center on his biography and tying together with classical political economy and some interpretations of it. So without further ado, please, Andrej, go on.
Wonderful. Thank you, Fernando. I'm super excited to talk to you about Karl Marx and his life and context of his ideas. Let me start sharing the screen first. And just please confirm where you can see everything as it should be. Wonderful. So today's lecture will continue what Fernando started on Tuesday, and that's trying to understand Karl Marx, his life, his work, and his impact on the world. There are only a few people scholars, philosophers, economists, prophets who have had so much impact on our world, and in whose name the world has been changed. And one of them is certainly Karl Marx. Let me start by identifying a few key dates so that we get a better idea in which period he lived and what were the main stations of his life. So he was born in 1818 and died in 1883 at the age of 64. And approximately in the middle of his life, he meets Friedrich Engels, 1844. And in between, before that, he studied law, philosophy, and history at Bonn, then moved to University of Berlin and received his PhD from Vienna in 1841. Then he became a journalist and editor at the Rheinische Zeitung, or the Rhine Gazette, a liberal newspaper, 1842 through 1843. And because it was banned, he had to find refuge in Paris, eventually had to leave for Brussels, moved back for a while to Cologne, and eventually ended up in London, where he spent the rest of his life from 1849 until his death in 1883. And perhaps the most important works that he published were in 1848, the Communist Manifesto with Friedrich Engels, and the first volume of Das Kapital in 1867, the only volume that appeared in his life, during his life. So let me start trying to understand how he turned from a philosopher to an economist. And to do that, one needs to understand his background and his upbringing. He was born in Trier, a city in the western part of current Germany, which was at that time part of Rhineland province of the Kingdom of Prussia. He was born into a family of Jewish heritage. His father converted to Christianity just a year before Karl was born, and for professional reasons, so that he could continue his job. And Karl was baptized at the age of 6 in 1824. Even though the ideas of Enlightenment influenced Marx on his views on religion, the exposure to anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish prejudice also shaped his critical views of religion and fueled his desire for social change. From 1830 to 1835, Marx attended high school, which even at that time was under police surveillance, because the Prussian government, a strictly conservative government, was afraid of various liberal movements. And he wrote a few writings that reflected his Christian devotion and desire for self-sacrifice. In 1835, he moves to the University of Bonn, and like a typical student, engages in student life. He gets arrested for being drunk, joins various political circles, but leaves after 1 year to study law and philosophy at the University of Berlin, the one of the most famous universities in the German space at that time, which was fully engrossed in Hegelian thought. So once he moves to Berlin in 1836, he gets exposed and introduced to Hegel's philosophy. Hegel died 1831, and he's a representative of an idealist philosophy that had this approach to the changes in the world as a result of clashes of a thesis with an antithesis merging into a synthesis, where ideas were the most important elements in that shaped the changes in the world. Marx initially found Hegel's philosophy distasteful, even claimed an illness, physical illness, as a result of pressure of the need to accept ideas that it disliked, and that was Hegel's philosophy that permeated the education in his at the University of Berlin. He joined, for instance, the Doctors Club, which was a student group that explored Hegelian ideas once he warmed up to them. And even later on, he joined young Hegelians, sort of left-wing Hegelians, where was a group of radical intellectuals. Some of them were students, some of them were theologians or university lecturers, who, after Hegel's death in 1831, tried to make sense of what he claimed in his vast work. And because Hegel's philosophical writing invited ambiguity, you had two different camps, sort of the right Hegelians, who interpreted Hegel's thought as supportive of traditional conservative values, while the left Hegelians, or the young Hegelians, who interpreted Hegel's ideas more in terms of being critical of religion and traditional authority, and welcoming even socialist thought. Prussian government, having the seat of government in Berlin, was extremely fearful of potential subversion that was imminent to young Hegelians, and undertook various drives to sort of push them out from universities. Those who were lecturing, like Bruno Bauer, who was extremely influential on the young Marx. And even though Marx was engaged in all these activities, his studies were not progressing that well. And friends and colleagues sort of suggested that he moves to University of Vienna, which at that time was considered as a sort of having lenient standards for accepting dissertations. And in April 1841, after 6 years of studying, he is awarded a doctoral degree for his work on an analysis of natural philosophy of Democritus and Epicurus, and employing Hegelian philosophy on trying to drive the difference between the natural philosophies of ancient philosophers. But what happened, what was of far more importance to Marx in 1841, was the appearance, the publication of Ludwig Feuerbach's The Essence of Christianity. In this work, this influential work that had far-reaching consequences of Marx, Feuerbach introduces materialism as an idea far superior to Hegel's idealism. And materialism in Feuerbach's interpretation claimed that material conditions, material objects, material conditions, the things that people engage in life, have far more importance than ideas. Ideas have a lower influence on the changes on the world, and than Hegel claimed. And so this turn towards materialism, or reinterpreting Hegel's sort of idea of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis as a never-ending progression of change in a human society, was an important element in turning Marx's philosophical standing at aiming to use Hegel's dialectic. So this process of engaging with a thesis and engaging and emerging antithesis resulting in a synthesis, Marx took it and employed Feuerbach's materialism to turn it into sort of dialectic materialism that would be the hallmark of Marx's philosophy that eventually becomes part of the Communist Manifesto, but also the work on Das Kapital. In 1842, after he graduates in April of 1841, he's for a while considered starting an academic career, but it was impossible due to the Prussian government's hostility towards classical liberalism, and especially the young Hegelians. What he does instead, he moves back to the western part of Germany, to Cologne, which is not far away from Trier, and begins writing to the Rheinische Zeitung. And eventually, in October 1842, what you see on this slide is the title page of the Rhinelander Gazette from October 1842, when after a few months of writing for the journal, he becomes the editor. He does not last as an editor for a very long time. By March 1843, he resigns, but this newspaper is brand new. In 1842, in January 1842, it starts being published, and is a liberal democratic newspaper backed by various progressive industrialists. This part of Germany, so the Rhineland part along the River Rhine, belongs to the most advanced industrialist regions, together with Silesia, for instance, in Prussia, and the various industrialists were more inclined towards ideas propagated by Adam Smith and its reception in Germany, that is, more towards liberalism, free trade, free markets, and the like. Once he becomes the editor of the Rhinelander Gazette in October 1842, part of his job is to write editorials. And those editorials include, for the first time, various social and economic issues. And this is a marking point for Marx towards becoming involved with economics, or political economy, as it was called at that time. Remember the lectures that we had before. By the time of Adam Smith, when we have the emergence of political economy, we do not have the subject of economics yet. Economics as a subject or a discipline emerges towards the late 19th century, during the era of marginal revolution, the topic that will be discussed next week. So while it writes about social and economic issues, those involve, for instance, the housing of Berlin poor, theft by peasants of wood from various forests, and also addresses the phenomenon of communism, sort of I'll discuss a bit more socialism and economic socialism in more detail later on in the lecture. Just for now, just remember that this was a turning point for Marx in terms of becoming engaged with economic ideas. And what he realized is that Hegelian idealism was a little use to these matters. And instead, he needed a different apparatus that eventually would come in a year or two's time. So in his writing, he criticized European conservative governments, but also people on the liberal spectrum, especially the socialist movement, which he viewed as ineffective but also harmful to genuine progress. His writings the publication of the journal was constantly checked by government censors, and he could publish only things that were approved by them. But eventually, he managed to publish a piece extremely critical of the Russian Tsar, and the Russian Tsar complains to the Prussian king, and that leads for the journal to be banned in 1843. Luckily, by the time Marx had resigned from his duties as editor, and he moves to Paris as a correspondent. But he's not alone. He is joined by his wife, Jenny von Westphalen, who comes from a minor nobility, from a well-to-do family. They know each other from their childhood. They grow up in the same region of Germany, and they've been engaged for past 7 years when they marry in June 1843. However, her family becomes more prominent. For instance, her half brother, since his father had a wife who died early on, her half brother becomes Prussian Minister of Interior, someone who would be sort of checking on newspapers and being in part responsible for censorship. On the other hand, her father, who sanctioned the marriage, was a follower of French socialist Saint-Simon, who I will be talking about a bit later on. And so um, the marriage is initially happy. It leads to 7 children. Only 3 of them reach adulthood, but eventually, once, and I'm jumping a bit, while she follows him to all the other stations, first to Paris, then to Brussels, slightly back to Germany, and then from 1849, after the failed revolution of 1848, they moved together to London. And thanks to her family, they're in part to various inheritances, they're able to keep afloat. And mm, however, Marx does not prove to be entirely faithful. With one of their housemates, he fathers another child, but and his wife Jenny needs to suffer through various indignities, especially in periods when they struggle financially. In 1844, Marx moves to Paris. He's already in Paris, the sort of the center of the socialist thought at that time, including the more radical communists. And he agrees to co-edit with the Liberian Hegelian uh, um, uh, scholar Arnold Rouge a new review in Paris, the German-French yearbooks, which were published in German and then smuggled to Germany. The Deutsch-Französische Jahrbücher, published by Rouge and Marx, appeared only once, actually, in double issue, and you can see the only title page on the slide here. And in this period, and through the editing of this single or double issue of this German-French annals, he turns more radical and revolutionary and moves towards communism, communist thought, and becomes associated with various French and German working men's societies in Paris. And he writes a manuscript, the Economic and Philosophical Manuscript of 1844, which gets published only a century later in German in 1959 and gets translated in English even later on. And this manuscript is sort of a key to understanding his transition from a philosopher to economist, and also how he integrates various pieces of thought. And one of the key impetuses that influences him at that time is also that he meets his long-term friend, his new long-term friend, Friedrich Engels. And the impact of the annals cannot be under stress. He, for instance, writes part of that issue a piece called toward the critique of Hegelian philosophy of right, and which contains, for instance, the oft-quoted claim that religion is the opium of the people, sort of a very critical view of religion, and quite radical for that time. And also is the first time it raises the call for the uprising of the working class people, the proletariat, that should realize the ideas, now again reflecting Hegelian perspectives, ideas of that philosophers put forward. And all these radical ideas that appear in the German-French annals led for the Prussian government to intervene yet again against Marx, and he gets banished from Paris and expelled and leaves for Brussels, and is followed by Friedrich Engels in February 1845, where he even renounces his Prussian nationality. But that also is the moment when he definitely turns his attention to economics. And the key person in that respect is Friedrich Engels, born 1820 and dies 1895, who comes from also very well-to-do family. His father is the owner of a textile factory in Prussia, and also a partner, co-owner of a cotton mill factory in Manchester, England. And his father sends Engels, the young Engels, for an apprenticeship in Manchester, where he stays for almost 2 years, from 1842 to 1844. And where he gets a first-hand account the Industrial Revolution and its impact on the working conditions of the workers and their families, and the harsh conditions, and engages into engages with economic ideas. Nevertheless, even though he once joins Marx in Paris and openly pursues revolutionary goals, once they get not once they do not materialize in the revolution of 1848 that spread across entire Europe, this very active liberal movement across from Paris to Berlin, Prague, Vienna, and other places across Europe, he reluctantly returns back to his family business, and sort of leads to some degree a double life, especially the double life that he led in Manchester, where on the one hand is a well-established entrepreneur or sort of coming from an entrepreneurial family, and on the other hand meets and engages radical thinkers, politicians who try to propagate and endorse socialist ideas. And I'll get back to what actually socialist ideas are later on. And so, even though the silver lining of him returning to the family business is that he's able to support his intellectual collaborator, Karl Marx, and Marx becomes extremely dependent and is also able to squander various inheritances that comes to him either from his father's side or from his wife's side, and um, uh, um, is not able to would not without Engels's support would not have been able to spend more than 2 decades researching in the British Library and working on various manuscripts. Once Engels's father dies, and he becomes the owner or co-owner of the company, he sells his share and spends the rest of his life living comfortably and like a gentleman, pursuing leisure and ideas. Here is a quote from the very first letter that survives from the correspondence between Engels and Marx, and it's from November 1844. And once Engels and Marx realized, especially when Engels realized that he shares so many ideas with Marx and they are essentially on the same wavelength. And so he writes in a sort of exhortative manner: "See to it that the material you have collected is soon launched into the world. It's high time, heaven knows. I too shall settle down to work and make a start this very day. Down to work, and then quickly into print." What is fascinating about this quote is sort of the how it sort of pans out later on. While Engels is able to put his pen to paper and publishes quite respectable pieces that gain him some notoriety, Marx is sort of this never-ending procrastinator who never is content with what he writes and keeps moving from one topic to another. And whenever an idea pops into his mind, he's able to read voracious amounts of material and write copious amounts of notes, but never sort of get to launching his ideas into the world as Engels exhorted him. The Brussels period for Marx, after 1844, when he's expelled from Paris, is a period of this deepened collaboration with Engels. They both produce a variety of manuscripts that do not find their publishers, but they engage sort of in a joint collaboration where Engels comes with this first account of what was going on, what are the consequences of the Industrial Revolution, and how that sort of feeds into the ideas that Marx has been developing in terms of sort of the inevitability of the development of or changes and progression in mankind, and sort of how history sort of has is arching towards a revolution organized by the proletariat, by the working class. And both Marx and Engels become extremely politically active, increasingly radical, and joined the Communist League, which in 1847. And this league is sort of a mixture of scholars, factory workers, people from various social classes who believe that the current state of as the world order as it is in Europe, being extorted in the factories. The working conditions are extremely poor, and they do not get their fair share of the profits, etc. This leads them to sort of a programmatic statement that would be written by Engels and Marx. And what they do is they sort of they procrastinate a lot on this project, especially Marx on this, and they start really writing it in December 1807, finish sort of in January 1848, and they write this 30-page booklet that's written in German, the Manifest der Kommunistischen Partei, which becomes a roaring success. It's written in 1847, published in across Germany. It becomes the most celebrated pamphlet in the history of socialist movement. It contains some of the most famous passages I will turn to, and sort of it's the first embodiment, sort of the materialistic conception of history. What it means is that Marx and Engels take Hegel's idealistic conception of history, sort of where ideas meet or theses or equating to ideas meet their antithesis, resulting in a new synthesis, which again becomes a new thesis, and which invites again a new antithesis, and so on. And so what they believe is, or how they restate it, is that it's the material conditions that determine this never-ending progression, or actually it's not never-ending, it has a finite state that it will reach. And the way how they open the manifesto is one of the famous, one of the several most famous quotes quotes by Marx and Engels, and that's a specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism. And a few lines later, the history of all hitherto existing societies is the history of class struggles. So, for instance, the class struggle embodied in the feudalism, which essentially really ended with in parts of Europe with the French Revolution, but in other parts of Europe in 1848 when serfdom was abolished, or even in Russia where serfdom was abolished a couple of decades later in 1880s. So, feudalism with its three classes: the aristocrats, the clergy, and the workers, the serfs, it gave way to a bourgeois society where a new class would become the bourgeoisie. And in this more capitalist society, where workers would become the underclass, would be destined to be overthrown and replaced by workers' society through this process of class struggle and class awareness of the dire situation of the workers. And the communists, that is, would become the vanguard of the working class. Communists like Marx and Engels, even though they came from a well-to-do upper class or upper middle class families, still they considered themselves to be the vanguard of the working class, who would provide the intellectual framework for the working class. And they would accomplish what they call the abolition of private property, a sort of hallmark of communism, and also that the proletariat would surpass the ruling classes, the aristocrats or the bourgeoisie, and they would become the ruling class. The Communist Manifesto also ends in a exhortative call for the battle cry, and it starts: the modern laborer, instead of rising with the progress of industry, sinks deeper and deeper below the conditions of existence of his own class. He becomes a pauper and pauperism develops more rapidly than population and wealth. And here it becomes evident that the bourgeoisie is unfit any longer to be the ruling class in society. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have the world to win. Working men of all countries unite. And this short extract of the final pages of the Communist Manifesto sort of has multiple references. Talks about the material conditions of the working class, referencing to dialectic materialism, also references to some of the classical economics ideas. I will later on expound a bit, and also reveals the sort of the class struggle which is underlying the changes or the progression of the history will inevitably lead to the overthrow of the bourgeoisie as the ruling class, and the working men become the new ruling class. After the unsuccessful revolution of 1848, Marx definitely leaves Germany and continental Europe and moves in 1849 to London together with his wives and children, and regularly visited by Engels. And what he spends most of the time is in the British Library. The British Library, with this magnificent dome and amazing reading room with the vast amount of reference materials and very skilled librarians, provides the new sort of intellectual home for Marx for the next decades to come. He has his favorite spot, G7, where he comes on a daily basis, in part to avoid the rest of his family, and in part to be engrossed with the ideas. You can still see the bench G7 when you visit the library, and nowadays it's far easier to become a reader in the library than in the mid-19th century, where you had to be a scholar. So having a doctorate from Jena from 1841 was a sort of a key access to getting a membership or a reader card in the British Library. And what he sets out is to an extremely ambitious plan. He decides to completely overhaul and provide a new systematic analysis of the society, both on economic, social, but political and historical terms. This vast endeavor was supposed to span six books. So by 1858, almost a decade after he moves to London, he wants to write 6 books. But the first of them completely occupies his mind and becomes the Capital, which grows into 3 volumes, or 4, depending how you count it, that we now have. And there is a sequel account of political economic theories, which was supposed to be another 3 volumes, which would be constituting the first book out of the 6. So his vast plans really do not materialize in terms of like a complete or finished work. The only thing that he is able to provide is, or to see through press, is the first volume of Capital from 1867. And surprisingly, all the 4 volumes of Capital, on the 2,200 pages, for instance, they reference the term communism only like 5 times, most in the footnotes, or talking about the future of society is also referenced in reference in passing. And it's because he had something far more ambitious in mind that he was able to deliver throughout his life. If he had the time and stamina and health to do that, then it was likely he would have turned to issues that are not covered in Das Kapital. And Das Kapital from 1867 is also published in German. Marx writes in German, obviously doesn't switch to English. And the subtitle is The Critique of Political Economy, Volume 1. And he was writing it from 1857 through 1878 while living in London on the various volumes of the Capital. British capitalism would be his main source of empirical material. But what's important to note that empirical material would be in a sense that is delivered through the British Library. He reads various statistics. He reads various parliamentary reports. There is a lot of empirical accounts about this dire state of capitalism in Britain and elsewhere. He is not a person who would be traveling to the factories. He's not a person who would have a first-hand account of what's going on in the real world like Engels did. He would be what I would call sort of an armchair theorist who is deeply engaged with empirical material, but at a distance. And what he promises to do, and what he states out to do in even the first volume, is to discover and reveal the law of motion of modern society. So this idea that is underlying both Hegel's idealism, but with his materialistic Feuerbach's-inspired turn, that modern society moves towards society where the underclass, the working class, becomes the ruling class. And what he sets out to do is, or actually what he does not set out to do, is to show that capitalism is awful. The life in capitalism is awful. Rather, what he tries to, he didn't want to condemn capitalism on moral grounds or Christian grounds, like many utopian socialists did. What he attempted was to sort of provide a scientific base for a critical examination of the economic writings of his time. So what he terms as well is scientific socialism, instead, as in contrast to a utopian socialism. So all the thought before him is relabeled as utopian socialism. It's a very similar move to what Adam Smith did. Adam Smith sort of coins the term mercantilism in a more disparaging way. And the same thing happens with Marx in terms of when he critiques the political economy. He also does not critique only utopian socialists, he also critiques in a substantive way classical economists. What is also important to note, and that also goes into in terms of the way how his work is received, is he mostly moved in a small circle of like-minded emigres, and he doesn't keep contacts with working class leaders of England or elsewhere. Is mostly superficial. So he's mostly engrossed with his own, what we would nowadays call his own social bubble. So let's take a look at utopian socialism, because I've used this word socialism and now also utopian socialism multiple times, and it would be worthwhile to sort of explain what it is. So socialism in general is a system of social organization in which private property and the distribution of income are subject to social control. And the differences are sort of in the extent and the kind of property the society should own and control. For instance, communism would claim that all property needs to be socially owned, while most utopian socialists would see space for private property. And also, the differences are also in the way in which society is to exercise a control of other resources in this society. So socialism is an umbrella term which includes various political movements that aim to put this idea of control of property and control of resources into practice. And there are multiple people who are associated with this utopian socialism as being used by Charles Fourier, Henri de Saint-Simon, or Robert Owen, who all emphasize non-coercive communities of people working non-competitively for spiritual and physical well-being of all. So let's take a first look at, for instance, one of the first people who actually terms the coin utopia, and that's Sir Thomas More from the 16th century, statesman, Chancellor of England, who gets beheaded because he does not allow the King Henry VIII to become, refuses to accept that Henry VIII would be the head of the Church of England. And he traveled before that in 1515 to sign a commercial treaty in Bruges in Flanders. And And that experience with emerging center of capitalism in Flanders, which would be sort of leading to how the Low Countries and eventually England would be undergoing a significant transformation in the 16th, 17th centuries, like the golden age of the Netherlands, where trade, discovering new parts of the world, and engaging in ideas about trade took place. And in Morse Utopia, which is the name of that More introduces word, which merges sort of two words, sort of refers to utopos as sort of a Greek place for a good place, meaning a good place, and turning into otopos, sort of a no place. So it refers to a place that does not exist, but and it would be a sort of a satirical description of a world with total religious toleration, and also where people would be working according to their abilities and consume according to their needs. Sort of mantra that socialism and communism in the 20th century would sort of herald that this would be something, a situation we will be approaching to and eventually arrive to. And also a place where there would be no poverty, free education to men, but also to women. And so he advocated communal, not private ownership, as a way of sort of controlling the sins of life, pride, envy, and greed. Another thinker now, instead of England, in Italy, Tommaso Campanella, from the late 16th, early 17th century, he's best remembered for the La Città del Sole from 1602, the city of the sun, um, where he would describe an ideal commonwealth which would be governed by enlightened reason and equal dignity, where everyone's work is designed to contribute to the common good, and private property, wealth, and poverty would be non-existent, as no one would be permitted to own more than they need. Skipping a century to the work of Andrej de Saint-Simon, as sort of an influential thinker and also someone who inspired Karl Marx's father. He was a French social theorist living in the period of the French Revolution, who foresaw the industrialization of the world and believed that science and technology would solve humankind's problems. And to do that, we would need to turn towards social and economic planning. And only once planning takes place, once sort of this control over the society, but also control over the economy and means of production emerges, then sort of a utopian socialism appears. Let me speed up a bit, because I could spend a lot of time on sort of various aspects of utopian socialism. The next one would be François-Marie Charles Fourier, another French theorist and philosopher, who claimed that modern society breeds selfishness, deception, other evils, because institutions like marriage, male-dominated family, and competitive market confine people to labor that is repetitive and frustrates people. And what he sort of proposed is sort of what is being called phalanstery, a society where people's needs and desires would be kept at bay, and would be self-sufficient communities of 1,600 people organized to according to principle of attractive labor, and people would be having multiple occupations, and they would be switching from one job to another as their interest waxed and waned. And he saw, for instance, also no private room for, so he saw a space for private investment, but ownership would be shared, and wealth inequality would have to be limited. The last utopian socialist whose life overlaps with Marx is Robert Owen. And he is not only a theorist, but he is also a practitioner who earned lots of money as an industrialist and decides to support labor unions and to spend most of his money. And the Lanark cotton mill in Scotland was the source of his income, which is remarkable for its social conditions, innovative welfare conditions, programs like limited amount of work hours, good working conditions, more time for workers to spend with their families, not allowing young children under the age of 10 to work, which was still common. Just recall any Charles Dickens's novels or movies based on them. And eventually, he decided to put his ideas into practice, and he created this new harmony um, in in Indiana, and he would make a public appeal for 1,000 settlers who would live in a communal setting where property would be commonly owned, and everyone would be sort of working according to their ability and needs. However, what it attracted was not sort of enthusiastic and skillful workers. Instead, it was mostly outcasts and misfits who essentially squandered all his provisions, and it turned into an anarchy, and Owen lost all his fortune in New Harmony and was forced to return to England. So what Marx does in his work is, so he contrasts it to with utopian socialists, whom he considers idealist, visionary, and use moral reasoning, and who emphasize harmony and cooperation. On the other hand, Marx is what he claims strictly scientific, materialistic, dialectical. Dialectical meaning employing Hegel's method. His view of history is historical materialism, driven by class struggle and changes in material conditions, while utopian socialists look at the history of more of a static society, where progress is often outside the historical context, and change should take place through the enlightened elites, reformers like Orban, while Marx sees the agent of change, the working class, the proletariat, which should start the revolution, especially in the place that would be the most radicalized, and it would be England. And while utopian socialists would emphasize a gradual reform, Marx would emphasize the revolutionary transformation as a climactic result of a class conflict and political struggle, where the class conflict plays the major role which utopian socialists would underplay. Other source of economic thinking in Das Kapital is classical economics, and let me just briefly go through, as part of it was mentioned by Fernando. This is his slide from Tuesday, where Marx engages with Adam Smith, the Wealth of Nations, David Ricardo, Jean-Baptiste Say, who is attributed the Say's law, Thomas Malthus, and John Stuart Mill, sort of a contemporary of Marx. And what classical economics, in Marx's view, does is that it is interested in growth and development, which eventually would culminate in some sort of stationary state. While for Marx, he would not be interested in that. It would not be about growth and development. It would be about social change. Classical economists would also concentrate on sort of cost of production and sort of how they determine prices. Something that he would share with classical economists is sort of labor theory of value that Fernando explained in far more detail on Tuesday. And classical economists also provide explanation of sort of the changing relation between the income distribution and prices, but also how the market system of markets has stabilizing tendencies, and is sort of effective in distributing income across the various strata of society without much government intervention, without any need for planning. And they were also vocal champions of individual political economic rights. They were opponents of slavery. It fought against protectionism, monopolies, and landowner privileges, but a completely not a radical way as Marx did. So, for instance, when we take a look at Robert Malthus, who was an ordained priest, and became a professor of history and political economy at East India College near London, in his most famous treatise, the Essay on the Principle of Population from 1798, where he paints an extremely gloomy picture of the future, a theory of population. And here I have two quotes. Population, when unchecked, increases in geometrical ratio. Subsistence increases only in an arithmetical ratio. And therefore, a slight acquaintance with numbers, sort of understanding how quickly geometrical ratio evolves and how quickly or how slowly arithmetic ratio grows. A slight acquaintance with numbers will show the immensity of the first power in comparison of the second, and the consequence for Malthus, and which appeared in multiple iterations of his work as it appears during his life. This implies a strong and constantly operating check on population from the difficulty of subsistence. This difficulty must fall somewhere and must necessarily be severely felt by a large portion of mankind, especially the working class, the poor. Um, um, on the other hand, drawing on Ricardo, who was a successful stockbroker who was able to buy a seat in the parliament and devote himself to political economy, and in 1817 publishes The Principles of Political Economy and Taxation, which sort of is considered as a not only a taking up what Adam Smith loosely expressed, but providing it sort of a very internally consistent, logically deductive approach that sets out through mathematics uh, all his ideas in a coherent way, but also proposes a number of original ideas like uh, uh, theory of comparative advantage, which is still remembered today, but also the iron law of wages, sort of stating that wages may not go up or down based on short-line fluctuation, supply and demand, but always tend towards subsistence, which sort of reflects Malthus's law of population. So the way how Marx engages classical economics is, for instance, that he rejects Malthus's law of population, because his edifice rests on the assumption that all value, including surplus value, is created by the workers, by the hours of labor involved or imputed in the product. As he claims in his Das Kapital, there is not a single atom of its value that does not owe its existence in unpaid labor. And the capital is nothing more than the product of past labor. And that's how Marx is able to claim that the bourgeoisie, the factory owner's income, the profit, the interest, or the managerial salary is unearned because it belongs to the workers. And the entire process is sort of explained. It was explained on Tuesday, so I will not go there for the purpose of time. So Marx, I talked about the philosophy, and here are some of the slides. So I'll just quickly skip that, as I have already talked about it. But let me talk about a bit more about Marx, and that there is not a single Marx, but many Marxes and many capitals. Uh, for, for a first approximation, let's take how Das Kapital was published. So as I said, the first edition, Das Kapital Volume 1, was published in 1867, and the manuscript can be dated from 1861 through 1867. And the first translation appears in 1880. Oh, the first English translation, I'm sorry, there were earlier translations. The first English translation appears in 1886, 19 years later. The second volume and the third volume, which were edited by Friedrich Engels, he worked mostly in the 1860s, slightly in the 1870s, and are published posthumously. Remember, he died in 1883. And they published first in 1885, the volume 2, and volume 3 published almost a decade later, 1894. And the English translation appears 22 years later after the German translation, 15 later after the third volume. And what happens is this lag between the publication of the first volume and the second volume led that Capital, the volume 1 of the Capital, had its life of its own. After its publication, Marx continually kept revising it. He is to borrow an analogy from Karl Popper, he would be the Beethoven, he would not be a Mozart. When you look at Mozart's scores, it's perfect from the first draft. There is not a second draft, it's always a first draft. What he writes down is perfect. When you look at the Beethoven's scores, it's always a constant struggle, rewriting, editing, crossing things out. And That's the same with Marx. He keeps returning back and revising and not being entirely happy with what happens. So even though the first volume is out, he keeps rewriting, especially value theoretical part one of the volume one. And mm, what he writes is able to write for the volume two and volume three is essentially a set of notebooks that Engels would reorganize, and the editors, the subsequent editors, will have impact on the result. It's like finishing an unfinished score, where you need to put some transitions, where you need to organize the material in a logical or coherent way, and um, what also keeps happening is that new and new material about Marx's ideas. So, for instance, one of the most important changes in the 20th century appeared in 1953, when one of the first works written after he met Engels, um, is the Grundrisse, the which was written in 1840s and sort of reflects the way how Marx was moving from a philosopher towards a political economist, and it's an 800-page long draft of the first volume of Capital. It's written dialectic style, but still it still has not completely shed its sort of philosophical Hegelian. Is not entirely in the way how eventually Capital number one appears. And the complete edition of Marx's works has not been finished, even though there are already 50 volumes. Another 50 are sort of expected, or they're about, I think, we're close to 60 now, and 40 are still to be published. And new manuscripts are being are forthcoming. So the way how to interpret Marx and how his contemporaries interpret Marx and how we can interpret Marx, this varies significantly. And also the way in which languages it appeared, as Fernando showed us uh, 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 on Tuesday. And I just quickly remind you of all the various editions that appeared in a quick succession. So the English edition is only in 1887, after a Russian and French appeared. And what is important um, to sort of understand is that this disparate way of sort of understanding, a sort of ability to pick various pieces in this large over that Marx has produced, mostly unpublished, unrefined, incomplete, um, allows us to reinterpret Marx constantly, but also dismiss Marx on various aspects that he does not provide a coherent coherent framework, that his predictions were not met in even in Engels's life after Marx died, and yet there is a lot that Marx needs to be credited with. Both Engels and Marx perceived, perhaps most clearly than all their contemporaries, the newness of the society the capitalist society in which they came of age. So the Industrial Revolution, that had no space in Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, even though Britain 1776 at the cusp of it, unfolded with dramatic repercussions on the social structure, on the organization of labor, on people moving to cities. Suddenly, people not being tied to land, but working in factories, uh, not working in agriculture. This had tremendous implications that contemporaries of Marx and Engels were trying to analyze and comprehend. But Marx was able to perhaps spell out in the most radical, novel, and comprehensive way. And what can be perhaps said of Marx is that he is perhaps the best theorist of market economics. He is a very bad theorist of a a socialist or a communist economics, where the tools of market economics are far best to explain why socialism or social planning do not work as it was hoped and shown in the course of the 20th century. And let me almost finish with one of my favorite quotes by Mark Bloch. From the economic theory in retrospect, and I remember that when I took a class with him, I remember this very vividly. Him telling also this: Marx, the economist, alive and relevant today. Marx has been reassessed, revised, refuted, and buried 1,000 times, but he refuses to be relegated to intellectual history. And now I would add, even though many would like that to be. And Mark continues, for better or worse, his ideas have become part of the climate of opinion within which we all think. And remember, this is written in 1997. It's all after the communism, the Iron Curtain fell. It is a dull mind that fails to be inspired by Marx's heroic attempt to project a systematic general account of the laws of motion of capitalism. And with that, I would like to end with a couple of references that could help you embark on a study of understanding and engaging with Marx's ideas. For instance, all his writings are available in various languages, in many languages on the website marxist.org. If you want to have a recent intellectual biography of Marx, which really carefully situates Marx in the tapestry of all the competing ideas, philosophy, sociology, um, uh, political economy, actual politics and social change, and the events of the 19th century, from the end of Napoleonic Wars to Industrial Revolution to the failed revolutions of 1848. Um, this situating Marx in this long 19th centuries, essentially from 1789 into 1914, then you should turn towards this 800-page tome by Gareth Stedman Jones, published in 2016, Karl Marx, Greatness and the Illusion. If you need something shorter, engaging, and part of a work about um, sort of a story of as written by Sylvia Nassar, The Grand Pursuit, the story of economic genius, even though many scholars do not like Nassar's style being sort of what they would claim journalistic or popular. Still, I believe this work, especially this chapter, is worthwhile to read to get a colorful image of Engels meeting Marx and their correspondence and the troubles and move to London and Marx's struggle, personal struggle, family struggles, but also intellectual struggles. Then you should read chapter 1, Perfectly New, Engels and Marx in the Age of Miracles. If you want to have a more careful understanding of Marx's Critique of Political Economy, and Critique of Political Economy is the subtitle of the volume 1 of Das Kapital, then you should read Keith Tribe's book, The Economy of the World, Language, History and Economics, by Oxford University Press from 2015, and its chapter on Karl Marx critique. In its 80 pages, you will learn everything that Fernando and I were not able to cover in such a short span of 2 lectures. So let me end here. I've spent more than an hour talking about Marx, and I'm super excited to see the questions that people might have.
So thank you, Andrej. So we have a couple of questions already. So let's
Mhm.
start with a restatement of a question was asked last time by Alejandro. Maybe you can answer it better.
Should I stop sharing the slides?
Yes, yes,
Okay.
you no longer have the slides on. So the
Okay.
question is there any influence from Kant's categorical imperative in Marx's theory of value? Because the way Marx talks about alienation, it seems that the value of the work is linked to the value of human being, which to Kant, a human being is extremely valuable.
Yeah, so it's I'm not a trained philosopher, so this is a difficult question for me to answer. But uh, from a historical perspective, I'm not qualified to answer that. But when you look at sort of uh, uh, whether there will be some compatibility, then my first hunch would be yes.
There are a couple more philosophical oriented questions that I know the rest will have to ask. So
Mhm.
Suzanne asks, what's the influence of Rousseau on Marx and Engels?
Sure. So Marx grows up in a liberal and in liberal environment that is influenced by Enlightenment ideas. So Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a prominent Enlightenment period thinker, is still present. Whether it had an impact on the way how Marx would be educated is unclear. We have little information about his upbringing. We have little information about the first 20 years of life. So we would enter the area of sort of guesses, and so that would be my best possible answer to that. Let me open the question.
Fernando, if you don't mind, Andrea and Fernando, I can try to help a little bit with answering that particular question about
Sure.
Rousseau. I think there is a connection in terms of the both the idea of history and the idea of the problems of society being found in existing institutions that are being systematic. You know, Rousseau was the first one to really, as they say, replace nature with history and say that there is no such a thing really as human nature, but that it sort of changes throughout time and it's sort of embedded in history. And then, you know, the other point that Rousseau made that I think is very present in Marx is the idea that we are, as he said, we are born free, but are everywhere in chains, and blamed our lack of freedom on the existing institutions, like the church and the state and all these different institutions. So I think that, you know, I think we can find a lot of connections between those two ideas specifically and Marx.
Thank you, Enrique. For those of you attendees that do not know, Enrique is a trained philosopher. So he's the best equipped to deal with these kind of questions. And another philosophically oriented question is, what aspect of Hegel's philosophy was the one that appealed to Marx the most?
Well, initially, there was not much that Hegel's ideas would appeal to Marx. And in the letter to his father, he would sort of complain that it was the cause of his illness, and he could not really study. But the intellectual environment of University of Berlin in the 1830s, 1840s was deeply permeated by Hegelian thought, and the various interpretation of Hegel. And so Hegel is a German philosopher par excellence, and I mean it both in good and bad way. So reading Hegel is an exercise of stamina and parsing sentences carefully. So but getting back to the question, I think what appealed toward at first was this idea of idealism, the way of looking at history as a progress of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, because that was also used in Germany to explain what it could mean for instance, the German nation, and it was still splintered across a variety of small municipalities, etc. But I guess Enrique, as our trained philosopher on board on the panel, might correct me or add more to this.
Yeah, no, I think you're totally right about that, Andre. You know, famously, I think as you mentioned before, Marx said that we had to turn Hegel's philosophy right side up. And you know what that basically what he means by that is, you know, Hegel thought that the ideas had primacy in moving history, and that and Hegel's dialectic between, you know, consciousness and spirit are basically the forces that move through history, and move the world forward. What Marx meant by flipping Hegel, you know, right side up is turning, you know, giving, instead of ideas primacy, giving material conditions primacy. Um, and so, but I think they do share this fundamental effort of trying to approach, thinking about the world in a kind of totalizing way, in a kind of systematic, wide, totalizing project, a project that is really kind of tries to be exhaustive about reality.
Now, another question related to something that you already mentioned, but perhaps you can elaborate a little bit more on what biographical works do you recommend for studying Karl Marx and gaining a comprehensive understanding of his life?
So, as I mentioned, one of the widely praised and most recent biographies, that is intellectual biography, very deeply based on archives, but also understanding the period. That would be Jones's Karl Marx, Greatness and Illusion. You have whenever you open a textbook on history of economic thought, you inevitably see a chapter on Karl Marx, and it contains biographical information. So if you're looking for something really accessible undergraduate level, Sylvia Nassar or even Heilbronner's The Worldly Philosophers, which is slightly outdated, but still very enjoyable to read. It can be a sort of a opening door towards that. But if you're looking for if you don't have the time to read 800 pages, then just take the chapter by Sylvia Nassar, and it contains quite a few references, whether to archival materials, but also to other work. And it's fairly recent, so it's 15, 14 years now. I do not remember seeing any movie about Marx's life that would be sort of that would provide. It's not like John Nash, Beautiful Mind. That would be sort of attractive and would make it accessible to through a different media than print. But perhaps there are some cartoons. I think I saw a few cartoons on YouTube that merge both his private life with his work.
Thank you, Andrej. A question by Raimundo. He asks, how modern Marxists explain that no capitalist society turned into Marxism? Perhaps he's referring to socialism, like why there's no socialism yet?
Well, to answer jokingly, the answer would be they have not turned yet. They will eventually. So it's a matter of time. But sometimes some of the reasoning is that the idea itself is right, except the execution was wrong. That you have sort of a spectrum of ideas that perhaps the what is more feasible is more like what you would see in the 60s or 70s in Sweden, instead of what was attempted in communist Russia. But Fernando, perhaps you have more thoughts or knowledge of that.
No, I mean, I think you basically you covered everything. I mean, I can go on and on, but I think you're basically correct. Yeah. So continuing with the questions, and more or less this is a follow-up, so that's why I don't want to intervene. It says, Argeno asks about the same question, but with a biographical bent. Is it true that Engels, in the last years of his life, hinted that they, which means Marx and he, had been wrong in their thesis of overcoming capitalism by revolutionary means?
Well, these rumors these rumors are sort of have an element of right, but I don't think it's exactly right. I think what Engels was more aware is that revolutionary sort of sudden revolution might not be the way to go. Sort of more flexible approach to social change might be more efficient, better suited.
So related to that as well, how important was Engels for Marx thinking, or was he the only guy, the guy that just paid the bills?
Say again, please.
So how important was Engels in Marx economic thought, or he was just the guy that paid the bill?
No, he was not the guy who just paid the bill. Well, Sure, he provided the necessary means that Marx was very keen and able to spend quickly and without any second thought. But it's thanks to Engels that Marx definitely turns towards political economy. I think it's Engels's sort of push once they meet in Paris that Marx realizes that he needs to embrace or engage with economic ideas. And throughout their decade-long friendship, it was also an intellectual friendship, which would be which also made him the ideal candidate for sort of publishing the second and third volume. Perhaps he was the person who best understood what Marx wanted to say, but was not able to say that he had available. So yes, so it's a very deep connection. It's he's when you see the posters like May 1st parades where you see Marx, Engels, and then Lenin, sometimes Stalin, depending whether Stalin's in power or not, or Mao if it's in China. Then he's rightfully there. He's not just the sort of after all, he's the co-author of the Communist Manifesto.
Good. Now, Pablo asks, and this is related to something that I think I talked last session, but maybe you can complement that.
Mhm.
Is there any update of Marx theories applied to nowadays capitalism?
Mhm. So what is an important episode is sort of in developing of socialist ideas in the 20th century is the calculation debate. The great socialist calculation debate of the 1930s, 1940s, where you have Hayek on the one side and Mises on the one side, and on the other hand, Oskar Lange and some other socialist thinkers, and about the feasibility of planning. And so nowadays, we have sort of a resurgence of the idea that planning might be feasible, and the feasibility of planning might be due to better computational power, artificial intelligence, that suddenly the central planner will have at their disposal what the communist planners in Soviet Russia or Eastern European countries never had at their disposal, something that would allow them to substitute the decentralized agents in a market economy, and instead sort of a central planner with this giant computer would be able to do instead what Oskar Lange was proposing, and sort of it is in his theory of central planning. So is it exactly Marxism? Some call it digital Marxism, as far as I remember, but it's sort of the repetition of this idea that better computational power sort of will finally solve the problems of planning. So that's one way of looking at this question.
Good. So another question by an attendee asks on the things that you were discussing. Could you expand a little bit on your remark that Marx quickly spent the resources provided by Engels? At least that's what he heard.
Yes, that's correct. So when you read the biographies of Marx, he seems to be quite profligate and not able to manage the purse very well, and even at the expense of his family. And he is this person who, besides being a great thinker, is not the most practical person in this regard.
So now a final question by me. So I want to ask you personally
Oh, perfect. Thank
about
you.
as your role as, well, you are the historian of economic thought here. So I would like to ask you, how high would Marx be ranked in history of economic thought, personally and in the field?
Mhm. So, of course, you need to say in what kind, according to what measure. If you take the measure of impact, he would be extremely high ranked because he's one of the few economists who had a real impact on the world for the better or the worse. You can take any Nobel Prize winners of economics of the past 60 years, and hardly anyone would come close to him in terms of how many millions and hundreds of millions or billions of people were influenced by his thought, whether it was correctly interpreted or not. If you take it, if you take sort of a very Whiggish approach, like what is the current state of economics and to what extent it depends on the past thinkers, then Marx would have a little impact. So the mainstream economics does not really use much of Marxian economics or socialist economics, and so in that regard, his impact would be limited. But if I would take sort of a personal measure, which would be sort of a combination of the two, sort of his historical relevance, his relevance for current for current state of society, or for his relevance for me personally, it would certainly be in the top 10, even though might not be extremely excited about it, but somewhere there.
Well, thank you very much, Andrej, for the talk. Thank you, everyone, the attendees. So remember that we will continue next week. So we are basically at the middle of the course right now, and we are entering the phase that we are discussing more modern economics, because we are next week with Ivan, and later on with our plenary speaker, Keith Rife, we will discuss marginalist economists, Marshall, and the beginning of what today we conceive as neoclassical economics. So thank you, everyone, and see you next week.
Wonderful. See you.
Thank you, everyone.